Thank you everyone for joining today. We will get started in just a second. So since it's our first time doing a webinar meetup, the whole point of these are to have talks where people are contributing to it. So what we would like to do is we're going to unmute everyone that's in this meetup because there's enough attendees where there won't be people talking over each other. But if you could please mute yourself unless you have a question, this way there's no feedback, and we will get started shortly.
ये डेटा कहाँ से आया है?
All right. Once again, thanks for attending our very first webinar meetup. We are very fortunate to have Melissa Tondi come in and present Expanding Your Mobile Test Plan. Melissa works at Shop at Home, and she has spoken at Star West and a bunch of other major QA conferences in the United States. And I will hand this off to you. Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be part of the East Bay Agilistry and QA meetup. When Mike reached out to me a few weeks ago and asked if I'd be interested, I jumped at the chance. So thanks everybody for taking time out of your, I'm assuming is your lunchtime since I'm in Colorado now. So I appreciate it. So this is quite a collaborative session. So just to give a little bit of background on both the content that you're going to be seeing that I'm going to be speaking on, and my background just as within mobile. About 3.5 years ago, I started a lab of people, process, and tools that focus specifically on mobile. And it was really an answer to challenges that test managers, directors, heads of departments, or leads were struggling to figure out. What does mobile technology introduce to existing testing teams, and how can we be better able to support the technology without necessarily adding more people, more headcount, or more money and budget to expand that? And then how do we also continue to keep the high quality that the teams were used to producing as far as their test management and execution, while offering support of new technology? And so as a department head, before that, I was struggling to maintain a balance between, how do we increase the technology that we're supporting without necessarily increasing staff and without necessarily an unending budget. So when I had the opportunity to start this lab of people, process, and tools, for the first 6 to 9 months or so, we spent most, if not all of that time, really doing a lot of heavy R&D into determining where mobile introduces areas that we can expand our test plan, and unique challenges that mobile introduced. And so for those of you who may be a little bit seasoned in your career, you may remember kind of either Y2K or the .com introduction, where a lot of companies expanded very, very quickly to adopt technology, but didn't necessarily put in the infrastructure and bones so that it wasn't a mass chaotic endeavor. So learning from those mistakes that we'd made in the past, and then also constantly looking to be lean and efficient within our own team, we came up with what I consider some really great innovations to help teams that have an existing or newly existing mobile strategy, and talk about areas that we've really put in place to be more efficient and more lean again, but also being innovative. And so we hope that although this is focused mainly on mobile, that the model and approach that we followed would be able to be kind of transparent and translated for other new and emerging technologies. So with that said, the slides and the content that I'm going to be going through, and that I'll eventually just send out to Mike so that you guys can have access to it, is about 3 hours of content. This was originally a workshop session at the STP conference in San Francisco 3 weeks ago, and then last week at the Mobile Dev and Test conference in San Diego, kind of slimmed it down to an hour. So I'm going to be giving a little bit of a condensed version of the content that you'll be seeing. And I'm definitely not a slide reader, so what I'll generally do is kind of go through the slides, let you absorb those, and I'll kind of touch on those, and then really talk a little bit more on what I consider the latter part of the content, which is some of the innovations that we've built in to our lab and that we're existing, and do a little bit more of a deep dive there. So I also encourage questions and collaborative sharing and examples. So if at any time you do have a question, since you are unmuted, go ahead and ask that, unmute your own device, and then ask me the question, and I will do my best to answer it, or I will throw that out to the rest of the audience and see if they have something to answer that. So with that said, I'm excited to share some of my knowledge with you, and I hope that you equally share some of your knowledge with the rest of us. So here's some of the takeaways and agenda. Again, we'll probably likely not really touch too much on the first bullet point as far as level setting. I think I make the assumption that either you have some sort of mobile strategy in place, or even if it's the beginning part of it, but certainly use the content that's provided in those slides to level set within either yourself or your team, for those of you who may be managers, leads, department heads, something like that. And really we just kind of go through just the two types of mobile solutions, and we focus on mobile web and apps. I do give a brief definition here of Internet of Things, or IoT, as noted in the agenda. But that's really just to differentiate a little bit between IoT and some of the innovations that are happening in that sector and field. And although I do put a little definition around there, certainly not deep diving in IoT as a result of this presentation. So we'll kind of look at expanding your test plan, which are kind of the last, the bullet points 2, 3, and 4, and what I believe areas that mobile has introduced, and then areas that we can start expanding our existing test plan, focusing a lot on accessibility, especially since, in my experience, some companies and organizations do a really great job of being accessible for all users, but in my experience, most companies don't really have a well built out accessibility offering, and so I'm offering, again in the content, some reference points so that if you don't have existing accessibility, or if you're looking at doing a little bit of research on there, provides plenty of information that you can kind of expand that. I am a big fan of user experience for all users, regardless of any impairments that they may have. So I'm a big proponent and ally of opening up and being a supporter for all users in this day and age. So I do put a little emphasis on there. And then I kind of move into some of the what we call innovations. Again, we kind of, I look at this content where anyone can take any or all of the content that exists in these slides and expand your existing test offerings or test plans. When we talk a little bit about the test types that mobile has introduced, literally you can copy and paste some of those, and those become test cases in some ways, or at least the beginning part of test plans. And then we kind of end it with some, again, what we call our flagship innovation, which is our device matrix, and it's a way for us to determine quickly and efficiently how to maintain and which devices to bring into a physical device lab. So we'll kind of focus a lot on bullet points 2, 3, 4, and 5, with bullet points 1 and 2 as main reference points. And as always, I'm available for questions during this session or afterwards. If you have any questions, we'll be more than happy to stick around, or we can take it offline and email or set up some time. So with that, I'll kind of jump in. So again, you know, I want to talk a little bit about our mobile solutions. And again, this is really kind of level set and use some terminology. I find that by me kind of defining terminology that I use at least gets everybody that's hearing me out in this and hearing the same thing. So we talk a little bit about two general mobile solutions, mobile web, and there are really kind of two ways that mobile web is being designed. One is responsive, the other is adaptive, although I will say that responsive is by and large. Oh, did I hear a question? No? Okay. So by and large, responsive tends to be the design and the direction that most companies are going for. Adaptive really is still very much, and if you kind of look at these definitions, adaptive still has certainly has a mainstay, especially for short-term promotions, marketing, blasts, things like that. But by and large, industry standards, there are really kind of two mobile web solution designs, and those are adaptive and responsive. And again, it kind of goes a little bit through some of the pros and cons. Again, you know, mostly the upfront you know, investment is going to be, it's harder to build initially responsive web design and websites, but it is very much more flexible than adaptive. Adaptive is obviously a little bit faster to initially build, but requires maintenance as new devices are supported and brought online. So again, depending on which kind of solution you're looking for and product that you're looking to provide your users, we generally look at both responsive and adaptive as good mainstays and really kind of fitting the bill of what your end result is to be. And then again, kind of go through a little bit. You'll see in this content especially that we talk. I'll kind of introduce a concept or introduce a term or an approach, and then I talk a little bit about things that as testers we should be looking at or be aware, especially for those of you who where your you know, your head of technology or engineering is looking at an IoT offering or Internet of Things offering. For those of us who are testers and are looking at what's the next big thing or what's the next thing that I should be professionally developing myself on. This is, again, a little bit of a definition here of kind of why IoT is important and, more importantly, where some of the limitation is. And so if you're not familiar with the terms IPv4, which is essentially our 32-bit addresses, our IP addresses that we, you know, most of us are currently using, we're moving into IPv6, which is almost infinitely going to expand the unique addresses of capability, since now all of our devices are going to be, you know, having a unique address. We needed to have a solution in there. So we moved from 32-bit to 128-bit addresses, and so IoT really was one of the catalysts in which to move into that direction. And then for those of you who, so as I mentioned before, kind of the mobile solution around mobile web, here are some things and some tools that you should be made aware of. And so if you're not currently using tools like Browser Stack, Responsive Test, Responsinator, Mobile Friendly Test, here's some tools where you can quickly check the responsiveness of your sites without necessarily going to a physical device. And again, I'm making the assumption that most of the attendees here are doing some sort of mobile testing or have some sort of framework and structure in place. So I'll kind of gloss over this a little bit. IoT in particular, you know, we tend to focus a lot from a hiring standpoint and roles and kind of professional development around white box and gray box testing, and there are lots of great white and black box testing. There are a lot of great definitions out there on what those means, but really IoT introduces an area where some companies might not put emphasis on as far as hiring and kind of gray box testing. And what you see here is just a very brief definition of what kind of gray box testing introduces in here. So these are, again, kind of what I see IoT introducing. And so for those of you who either are actively you know, providing IoT products and experiences, or if you are on the edge of wanting that, here are some resources for you as a tester to kind of expand your repertoire and portfolio and resume and get very familiar, if not expert, in these three areas here. Okay, So then we go into our, and again, I'm going to kind of gloss over this a little bit, then our kind of the second industry standard of mobile solution is around apps. So we generally have our native apps, and again, here's a brief definition of what a native app is. And then we move into hybrid apps. And these are, a little bit more, it's interesting, and I would love to hear any of your feedback as far as whether or not your current mobile app solution is more native or hybrid. So if anyone would like to share that, please interrupt me and kind of let me know. But I personally, yes, go ahead.
Oh, no. So I was unmuting myself. I was just going to make a quick comment. So
Okay.
for anyone that's just come in, so I'm going to unmute everyone so all the attendees can ask questions whenever they like. But if you could just mute yourself on your side so there's no feedback coming through. This way we can keep, so Melissa can keep talking. But if you do have a question you want to ask, then you can just unmute yourself. Sorry, keep going, Melissa.
Okay. All right. So we're kind of on the app solution here. Hybrid apps again. Specifically, they're developed with the same technologies. They use primarily CSS, HTML, JavaScript, but they really are kind of they're ensuring cross-form compatibility, and they're accessing the phone's hardware components in there, like the camera, GPS, contacts, etc. And then this is an interesting innovation. Anyone have familiarity with the term near native, or are actively testing or developing on any near native apps as it relates to this definition? Okay, and this is an interesting one, and I was debating a few weeks ago whether or not to even include it, but because we're talking about innovation, I find that by introducing even terms that may or may not be familiar to the audience, it's really interesting to get feedback on near native. One of the biggest limitations between platform development, specifically on iOS and Android, is that there's hardly any code reusability, which from an efficiency standpoint, it's inefficient, and which is why we generally, but of course, if you're Apple and Google, you love that kind of closed or proprietary platform in here. So near native really kind of introduces the concept of there's a much higher percentage of code reuse across the platforms, but they're written in generally at the app accelerators Titanium. So it may be interesting for you to kind of do your own research on near native. So the app obviously is targeted to multiple platforms, but it runs natively on each. So it's an interesting potential scenario when we talk about hybrid and native apps, that there's kind of some emerging tech around near native. So now that we've kind of gone through the two generally industry standard types of mobile solutions, web and native, we talk a little bit about some areas of things that you need to know. And again, I'm not going to read through all these. I'll kind of skim through some of these slides here, but as we start moving into now expanding and innovating your existing test plan around mobile and what it introduces, here are some areas that as testers you should be looking at, or you should be adopting, or at least researching out, so that kind of where mobile introduces some of these challenges and what I mostly call opportunities, and areas that you should be aware of as you start adopting and expanding your own mobile test plan. And again, this is kind of breaking down the differences between the operating systems, and I will say that I'm fully aware that there are more than 2 platforms around for mobile solutions, mobile app solutions outside of Android and iOS. But for the sake of market share and for the sake of the content of the audiences that I've delivered this to in the past, we generally focus on Android and iOS. Although a lot of the components and approaches and models that I'm kind of introducing here can certainly be expanded to support other platforms such as Microsoft or BlackBerry or some of the others that are coming about. But just for the sake of brevity, we focus mainly on Android and iOS. Okay, so I'll kind of pause and make sure or see if there's any questions as we kind of talk about just kind of the 2 types of mobile solutions that are introduced, and now we're going to get into kind of what I call the meat of the content here is really kind of talking about expanding your test plan. So I'll pause a little bit, see if there's any questions, and if not, I'll move right into some of the test types that we've identified that if you're not currently testing for, you should start looking at to bring into your existing test plan. Any questions? Okay. All right. So again, kind of
Melissa, I think we have a
yeah.
question over here.
Yeah, this is Rick. No,
Okay.
just as you were talking about, maybe you're going to get into this a little bit more too, but as you're talking about, like, I guess one of the things was like near native. So as you look at, I guess as we're level setting, and as you look at the types of apps that you test on, whether it's a native or a near native or HTML5 type of app, does that affect how you build your test plan up then? Is that kind of what you're saying based on those different variables?
It really kind of comes into, yeah, I would say it affects how you build your test plan as it relates to technology that you may need to become familiar with. So it's really introducing the concept. As far as the test plan and then the test cases that are built out into your test plan, mobile in particular, whether it's web or native or apps, we kind of identify the types of tests that mobile, regardless of whether or not it's a mobile or mobile web or app, it's kind of agnostic against that. It's really more level setting and saying, here are the types of solutions that exist now, and you should become familiar with which solution you're currently supporting or that you're going to be expected to support.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Okay. All right, so we'll move into expanding your test plan. And again, this was based off of that kind of 6 to 9 month heavy R&D mode where we were really trying to get ahead and be proactive with teams that we knew were going to have an influx of, the mandate of mobile first and being quick to market for mobile solutions. We really identified what we kind of call test types, and these are what you can kind of read this as test cases in which you would build out. And again, so the way that I have these organized is, types of tests and then potential test cases. In no way am I saying that these existing test types that I'm going to kind of scroll through here are comprehensive, but they are pretty up to date. We tend, in my group here, we tend to do some R&D ourselves about once every month to 2 months to make sure that things like, say, iPause, which was one of those gestures that we thought were going to take a little bit more of a market share for some of the devices that were introducing that. But we've removed it since because we know that the market share is just not there at the moment, but specifically around gestures. So this is kind of a list of tests that you should be looking for. And of course, this is not 100% comprehensive across the industry, but it's comprehensive enough to ensure that you've got a little bit of a checks and balances between what you're currently testing for, what your product actually does, and names and terminology to use to start bringing into your existing test plan. So I kind of pause on this particular slide because under interruption test, and I will say that gestures, we always have a nice dynamic conversation around gestures, specifically around the tap and the press, long press, short press, all that. I didn't want to get too much into the weeds on here, but these are types of gestures that run across, devices especially. But one of the interruption tests that we have here between the controlled and uncontrolled, and you see that I have elevator in quotes here. This was a funny story. We were testing a beta product app, and one of the guys in the lab wanted to go. We were in on the 14th floor of a 24-floor building in downtown Denver, and it was a really nice day out, and we were in the middle of testing, and one of the guys that was testing the app decided that he wanted to go outside and kind of enjoy the weather, so he got into the elevator as he was actively testing the app, and all of a sudden it became an uncontrolled interruption because all of a sudden, of course, he lost network connectivity, and by the time he got out of the elevator, the entire app crashed and was unrecoverable. So we kind of affectionately termed that elevator test. But what you'll see here and some of the other types of testing types that I'll scroll through here is, what mobile has introduced to our industry more so than anything is that the user is king, and the user experience, if it's not being emphasized in somewhere else in your organization, whether it's product or user experience or design or user acceptance tests, if that's not being heavily emphasized somewhere else, then as testers, it is kind of incumbent upon us to be the keeper of some of those user advocacy and user experience tests, specifically around real life scenarios. So as much as is possible for you to do, I would certainly, when we get to the point where we identify types of tests to really verify on the physical device, I would highly encourage real-life user scenarios like the elevator test or like moving in and out between hotspots and Wi-Fi and cellular connectivity, because that's exactly what your users are going to do. And I'm assuming everybody here has a smartphone in some capacity and looks at reviews out on your app stores, but we also know that a bad review and a bad user can destroy an app and in some cases destroy a company. And so, at the forefront of what we as testers do is certainly coupling with our technologists that we're supporting in the code, but there is a lot of opportunity with mobile introducing this to become closer to user advocacy tests in addition to that. So I highly encourage types of testing to really kind of go through what, in addition to these types of tests that I'm showing you now, is to really do some real-life scenarios where possible. All right, so these are the test types, and again, if you're not currently doing them, or if you, there's some definitions that exist out there, but we feel that this is a pretty comprehensive list in which to add to your existing test plan and services that you offer within your testing team. Okay, I'm going to move into kind of something that's near and dear to my heart, which is accessibility. And really, accessibility is just having the worldwide consortium, W3C or the WCAG guidelines. I listed both of these sites here. One is for the web and one is specifically for mobile, which is a bit newer. The WCAG guidelines, and for those of you who don't know what accessibility is, you may know it by some of the U.S. term called Section 508. And really, I like to use the term accessibility because it assumes that it is not just U.S.-based guidelines and conformance, but it is international. So, which is why we tend to go to the WCAG and W3C guidelines, because we're assured that it is more of a global type of guidelines and checkpoints. So, what I provide here is just some high-level information on what it is. And for those of you who have a well-defined and established accessibility approach or process or team within your organization, great. This is probably not new to you. But for those of you who may be looking at this thinking, oh, I don't know what any of this is, really what this is saying is, and again, I say this is near and dear to my heart, because as users, we tend to, and as testers, sometimes we tend to test according to our human components versus all and being accessible for all human components. So for those with impairments, for those of you who may be familiar with the Americans with Disability Act that was introduced in the 1970s, I believe, which is, essentially all citizens should have accessibility to public areas and places and streets and sidewalks and buildings. This is really kind of its equivalent for the internet and for the mobile age now. So there are three levels essentially: level A, level AA, level AAA. Level AAA is really kind of the end all be all. This is really kind of reserved for particular companies that may be doing business with the government, education systems, or any type of entity that is catering or supporting those with impairments. I kind of put in here that level A is a good place to start. And again, if you kind of look through the WCAG guidelines here for both web and mobile, you'll see kind of the approach that we take around testing. And so you can get to the point where you have a good understanding of how accessible your products, whether they're web or mobile, are to all people coming in, regardless of their impairments or disabilities. So here's an exercise, and certainly we don't have time to do it as part of today's webinar, but this is a good exercise for you to do on your own here. And for those of you who may not have tested accessibility, the great thing again, and I like to highlight kind of, sometimes we see introducing new technology is disruptive, and the negative connotation of disruptive. I tend to think of it, I like to put a little bit of a different spin on it, where we call them opportunities, and where I think emerging technologies or new technologies have come into play is that they have learned in some ways from mistakes that we may not have caught when we introduced the previous new technology coming in here. And that's really around accessibility. So, and again, I focus mainly on Android and iOS in this session. But here are some exercises that you can do depending on which platform you're using, which device you're using. And both Android and iOS platforms offer accessibility already built in. And here's how you, if you don't know this already, here's how you would access your accessibility depending on your platform here. So again, kind of in a later time, or if you want to do that now, feel free to check it out and start turning on either TalkBack or VoiceOver, and you'll see how those with impairments, specifically around visual impairments, actually access your products when they are either lower sight or non-sighted. And just some things to know specifically around accessibility for Android gestures. Android is kind of taken the stance where not only are they accounting for those with visual impairments, but they're also accounting for those with maybe limited mobility around with their specifically around their hands or fingers, or however they're accessing and using gestures. So they've actually created the concept of one-finger gestures in case there is limited mobility for their users. And so again, these are kind of different types of instructions on how to do gestures using Android's TalkBack. And then with the iOS, they actually still support 1, 2, and 3 finger gestures. So not that that's necessarily worse or better than Android, but it's just a different approach that each of the platforms and companies have taken as far as mobility, with not just lower or no visual impairments, but with lower mobility as well. So again, these are kind of some exercises and some gesture definitions that you can look at. And again, if you're not, it might be a fun exercise for you to actually go in and test your current mobile product offerings, whether it's web or app, using accessibility features that are already built into your devices. Okay. Any questions before we move on kind of to some of the other testing and where appropriate and when not appropriate, and devices and all that? Any questions before I move on to the next section? Okay. All right. So now we're kind of getting down into the weeds. So now we've identified types of testing that mobile has introduced to our existing world, and again, that's ever expanding. So now one of the biggest challenges that we had faced was, at what point, what do we test on devices, physical devices, and what is appropriate to test on emulators or simulators coming out of each of the platform's SDK. And so, I like to ask this question in some of the other sessions because the answers are varied, but I'll kind of give you a little bit of a preview of what I generally ask. So I'll ask the audience members of, how many have, their devices are, every time that a new device is offered on market, or they get some sort of a ping, where a manufacturer is going to be introducing a flagship device, the very first thing that they do is they would go and purchase that, or somehow get onto the beta program or partnership with that device. And so some people raise their hand on that, and others kind of figure out, well, we'll just kind of create our lab based on whoever has a device or I only have one device because it's my own personal device. So it really kind of varies. But what we really found was there was a lot of inefficiencies that teams were doing, because if they took the approach that all testing should be done on physical devices, well, you can probably see where some of the overhead and maintenance would be. Number one, the overhead would be, now I'd have to go either into another room or bring that device over to my desk, make sure it's charged, make sure it's plugged in, make sure I can find the cord, make sure it's synced up, all that kind of stuff. And so by the time we were actually ready to test on one device, we probably could have run through tests either automated or manually, 10 times over. And so, we knew that even though the manufacturer, specifically Apple, makes the statement that they always recommend testing on physical devices only, that's going to be the best way for you to, make sure that you've uncovered all of the user experience issues. And that is a very true statement. But we also know that the reality is that we sometimes don't have the time or sometimes the physical devices to actually get that going. And so we knew that there was a good way to balance out, having a lab that was built of both emulators and simulators and physical devices. So what we're talking about here is just kind of giving you some types of scenarios. So if you look back at those tests that I shared that we believe mobile's introduced, we kind of break those down into those types of tests. Which of those tests are appropriate to test on emulators and simulators, and which ones should really be held to the physical devices? And again, this is kind of some of the areas where it is fully appropriate to test on simulators and emulators. And a lot of times, your development team may be already taking care of this because they're going to be using those M's and Sims, using the SDK themselves. And if you don't have access to the SDK, or if you don't have access to emulators or simulators coming out of the platform, I would highly encourage you getting that going. When I came into Shop at Home a few months ago, the SDK was not available to our testers, so they were forced to test everything on the physical devices, which, again, became very cumbersome and added a lot of overhead to our existing testing cycle. And so by kind of pushing and getting those and using these, some of these recommendations on when and where to test those specific tests against, you become a lot more efficient in your initial offering. So again, I'll kind of scroll through here, talk a little bit about when it's appropriate to test against emulators and simulators and which types of tests do that. Here's just a little bit of a summary slide on what that is. And then we kind of move into the device testing. And I know this looks like a much longer list than the previous list here. And I would say that, again, this is a comprehensive list. Your product might not have or might not use a lot of these tests, but these are kind of pulling out of the tests that are introduced by mobile and now breaking them into when and where you should be running those, or when we recommend you can run on simulators and emulators versus physical devices. Okay. All right. So I like this slide, and I like to pause on the slide. And this is a little bit outdated, or not outdated, but it's a little bit dated, just because I know that it's absolutely been updated as far as the device fragmentation. You can probably see where I'm going here. As new devices, and especially from the Android world, where we know that there are multiple permutations of operating systems, devices, all that, and Android users are, because it's a much more flexible, open platform, it introduces a lot of permutations in there, which makes a tester's role very cumbersome and sometimes very, very tedious to make sure that we cover the correct amount of permutations without infinitely expanding the amount of time that we have to test against devices. So what we're seeing here is kind of the slide of what actually the Android is introduced into our world, and this is really mainly the U.S. based. And so if you look at a global type of device fragmentation, you can see how much that would expand here. But it's an interesting slide because this looks very daunting, and so we had the same idea. It's very daunting. How could we possibly ensure that even if we've decreased the number of tests that we should be testing against devices, we still don't necessarily solve the problem of device permutation. So here's the device fragmentation that's introduced specifically by Android. And what we came up with, and this is kind of what I'm calling the kind of one of the flagship types of innovations that came out of our lab, is the device matrix technique. And I'll kind of go through, this slide is a little bit better. What the device matrix technique allows us to do is it allows us to keep a specific number of devices with a reasonable coverage. And so I will say that with the device matrix that we have, that then essentially defines the number of physical devices and what types of physical devices we keep in our own lab. The idea is that we're becoming efficient. And so we're not necessarily going for 100% coverage, but what we've come up with is we know that from our device lab, we could have 9 Android devices, and we'd have somewhere between 94 and 96% coverage, which is a pretty good, which is actually very good coverage, and only needing to maintain 9. You could actually drop that number, those numbers of devices down to say 6, and you would still have in the high 80%, somewhere between 88 and 90% coverage, with even just decreasing that number to 6 devices. So you can see that, again, we're looking for efficiency, not necessarily 100% coverage, but we're really being thoughtful on what the devices introduce and the main components, characteristics that are important to us. So, and I pause on this slide as well because, in addition, if 100% coverage or very close to 100% coverage is something that you or your team is being measured by, there are obviously some augmentation like Perfecto, Keynote, AWS Device Farm, and Cloud Test Lab, where you could get those kind of outlier devices that you may not want or need to bring into your own device lab, but that you may need to test on those. And so these are really good options. So between the device matrix and augmentation with one or more of these 4 examples that I'm listing, you could get to the point where you'd have coverage and not necessarily need to maintain all of the physical devices yourself. So, so what we do, and I am going to go into a little bit of detail as far as what the device matrix does. And so again, this is saying, okay, we've identified tests that we believe are appropriate to test against emulators and simulators, and we've identified tests that we believe should really only be tested against physical devices. And now we're at the point, okay, now which physical devices should we be looking at bringing into our lab? So again, if we go back to the scenario or example that I've given before, most of our acquisition, most of the company's acquisition is we look and see which device is coming out. We get on either the pre-order, or we stand in line, or we somehow order that device, and that just gets added to the lab. And then next thing you know, the next time another device is, our lab starts getting infinitely larger with no real deprecation or no real thoughtful way in which to determine the number of devices and whether or not there's any redundancy in there. So we came up with a device matrix technique, and we decided to define these specific example categories. And so these are categories that we thought make sense as far as what we were seeing. And so if you, and again, this is, if we go back to the Android example, by using all of these 9 categories, we were able to get to 9 devices with high, in the 90-ish percentage of coverage in the US. You may look at these 9 example categories and say, well, 8 example categories, and say that we don't care about the abnormal or the oldest or the common or a catch-all. And you could actually get to the point where the number of physical devices is decreased because some of these categories may not be applicable to you or your team. So again, this is kind of a sample of categories, and I'll show you what a device matrix looks like right after this. So we have these types of categories of phones. And again, these kind of are mostly against manufacturers of phones or devices here, and not just phones, I should say. They're both tablets and actual phones. And then, so if we look at here, so you'll kind of see the category to the left, and then we have what we call characteristics to the right. And I'll go into definition of exactly those mean. So what you're seeing here is a sample slide of what a device matrix looks like. This is by design not updated because I don't necessarily want to put that out there and publish it and say this is what your lab should look like, but this is what our lab looked like about a year and a half, 2 years ago. And so you can kind of start seeing as we start putting in characteristics and categories and building out, we can start fleshing out some redundancy between, say, operating systems, sizes, densities. So instead of having the approach of we're just going to get the newest device for every single manufacturer anytime it comes to market, can actually, before that device is made available, the specifications are certainly made available, and we plug those specifications into our device matrix to see if it makes sense to bring that in, or if really truly are having so much redundancy that we assume the risk of keeping our lab without purchasing that new device in there. So here's what a sample device matrix looks like for, say, Android, and here's what it looked like for iOS. And I would say that iOS very specifically, we know that the number of devices for an iOS lab right now, I think we have 4 devices across, and that is in the high percentage of the 80s, which in our world was a good percentage for us to hit, and that we're doing that with 4 devices. You could expand that to more than 4 devices if there's a need for you to increase your coverage up to, in the high 90s or 100 or close to 100%. But you can start seeing the different characteristics and categories that we started building between both Android and iOS. And so for those of you who support outside of those platforms, other devices and other platforms, you can start building out your own device matrix using example or sample categories and characteristics that we've built out. So again, when we determine our device matrix, the end result is that we're logically selecting the devices. We're no longer needing to always purchase the first one out there, but we're also logically looking at deprecating devices as well. And so this meshed with good end user metrics and analytics to see what your actual users are coming in on. If you have access, and hopefully you do have access to that information, you can start being very efficient with when and how and which devices you actually test against, because we know that of all of the tests that happen, those cause the most overhead and are generally the most expensive just because of the time it takes to spin those up if you are responsible for maintaining and building your own device lab. Again, if you go back to Perfecto and Keynote and some of those other options that I showed, of course they offer a full solution to test against all devices, but clearly with a cost, and in some cases reservations, time needed, and all that. Okay, so I'm gonna pause there and see if there are any questions on anything that I covered, because I definitely want to, we've got about 12 minutes left in this time. There are additional slides here where we talk about tools, and again, I will send this off and you guys can use this as your reference and use it for any kind of research that you want. There's several slides after this where we talk about different types of test environments and tools, specifically around automation and performance. But I wanted to pause there and see if there are any questions, or if anyone wanted to share some of their examples or some of the challenges that you may be facing right now within your mobile strategy, and see if we can maybe collaboratively talk that out. Okay, I'm going to assume no. All right. Okay, so why don't we, let's see, again, you have about 9, 10, 11 minutes left here. I'll talk a little bit about, maybe I'll skim through the rest of these slides here and just kind of talk a little bit about what I'm introducing here. And again, these will be available for you for reference. So we've got different types of test environments. Some of the 2 that are very well known, BrowserStack and SoftLabs.com. Again, these are mostly paid for types of online simulators. And again, if you have a budget and you want to augment your existing lab, and we kind of offer solutions around if you are fully and wholly responsible for maintaining your own lab with little to no budget to tap into some of these other vendors or tools that are paid for or consultative services. The option is to use the SDK simulators and emulators that come within the platforms that you're developing on, and then having some sort of a device lab that you maintain yourself, and then of course all the way up to if you have unlimited or high budget, then you kind of start tapping into different types of consultative or vendor paid services like BrowserStack or SauceLabs.com in here. So I always get the question, and this is essentially a full other session around automation and performance, and specifically around mobile, and I talk a little bit about it in some of these slides, and in the half-day workshop we go into a lot more detail around these. But these are some things to know, that if you don't have an existing automation tool strategy in place, and you're looking at expanding your own automation to include mobile, you kind of get into the categories of paid or open source. And from a paid standpoint, there are a lot of great commercial tools out there. Some are reasonably priced, some are very, very high priced, and in a lot of ways you do get what you pay for from a reporting standpoint. For those of you who may be going down the open source path, I think I'll speak for the industry and say at the moment Selenium and Appium are kind of the two open source tools that most of us have adopted. We've been Selenium users for many, many years now, and we've successfully created a framework that is out and available on Git that has an Appium overlay. So we have a full-blown web and mobile framework that we've developed that's out there in open source land that if you're interested in, then I can absolutely send you information on that. But what we know is that tools introduce challenges and inefficiencies on their own. And so if you are in the middle, or if you're in mobile tools infancy, here's some really good information for you to know specifically. And again, kind of going through the open source versus closed. Obviously there's a reason for both between open source versus closed or proprietary or commercial tools in here. For those of you who may be in highly regulated industries where all tools need to be certified or third party, you tend to get a lot more of that certification, independent validation with closed or proprietary tools. But there are a lot of good approaches right now to where Selenium is becoming the adopted and in some ways signed off and validated tool for even in very regulated industries. So I kind of go through some of the open source options around mobile. This is certainly not a comprehensive list of open source options, but these are probably the most popular and the most used across industries within software testing. And if you've used any of these and want to chime in on your experience, I'd love to hear your thoughts on those. And then we go into the closed or the proprietary commercial types of tools: Eggplant, Ranorex, Test Complete, HP UFT. These are really good closed and proprietary solutions, again with a cost associated with them. I've used, or we've used in some capacity, all of these tools, both open and closed, and so we have opinions on all of them. It really depends at that point of budget and time and money. And then we kind of move into other tools, and I'll kind of skim through these a little bit. Yes.
This is Mike. So I got a question over here. It says, do we need to perform rooting and factory reset to test backup and restore features for native apps?
I would say that that is a good practice, although it definitely introduces some overhead in doing it. So I'd say that short answer is yes, you should be doing that, but not necessarily, and that would really kind of fall under how risky and how close is your user, how much are your users actually going to be doing that. I think once a cycle is probably a good number to do that, depending on just from my limited knowledge of what you're particularly doing or asking, but I'd say yes, it's a good idea to do it.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yep. So one thing that is kind of a newer tool here, when I presented this even 3-4 weeks ago, there was no known or well-known, I should say, performance client-based performance testing for mobile apps. AT&T Aero has just kind of been introduced, and I've been poking around with it for about the last week or so. It's a very interesting tool if you are trying to gather client-side performance specifically in here, and I can't speak to it as in a detail since I'm just now kind of looking through it in the last week or so. But as you're looking at, again, expanding your mobile testing offerings, performance is one of those areas that is kind of in its infancy, specifically at the client side, and I'm really glad to see that companies or individuals are starting to develop client-side based performance for mobile apps in particular with AT&T Aero. It is a free application. It's a free tool that you can go and download. It's really interesting. But for the most part, we still really look at some of the existing performance testing and engineering practices that really kind of fall to the back-end server where you're looking at load and actual performance versus all of the different types of performance testing that comes about. It still really doesn't change much because you're still testing the back ends that you would normally do in a web world or web scenario here. But it's nice to see that there's a tool that's kind of coming up and gathering a lot of good following around client-side performance as well. And then, of course, we've got some other tools that just, these are not necessarily mobile specific, but these are really great tools that you should be looking at, especially if you're looking at continuous integration, continuous delivery, if you're really kind of if you're a mature agile shop where you're looking at continuous code pushes. These are areas and tools that you should be considering to expand your existing mobile or really existing testing plan and offerings. Okay, so that kind of brings me to the end of this. Again, here's some of my information. Again, I'll definitely get this slide deck to Mike, and he can post it onto the Meetup site, and I'm more than happy to entertain any questions in general about the session. Or if you'd like to contact me, after the session and have specific questions that you'd rather not ask with everybody else, I'd be more than happy to entertain any of those questions as well. So, questions, comments, feedback, anything that I can answer in the last couple of minutes.
I'll let you know if any questions come through the GoToWebinar app.
Okay, great. Well then, with that said, I'll kind of first thank you for hanging out here during your lunchtime. I appreciate your time, and I'll turn it over to Mike.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Melissa. That was awesome. And everyone, thank you for attending. I really appreciate it. This was a fun experience to try a lunchtime webinar meetup versus having one after work. I would love any feedback that you guys have. If you could message me through the Meetup site and just let me know if you liked it or if you'd like to do it again. We're always trying to try different ways to have these meetups to continue to build a community for you guys to develop your skills. So I really appreciate it and hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Oh, hold on, I might have a question.
Oh, okay.
Nope, all right, looks like it's just some comments saying that they thought it was really informative. So, awesome.
Okay.
Well, thank you guys.
Great.
Hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks, Melissa.
Thanks, guys. All right, bye-bye. Bye-bye.